This week, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a series of significant decisions as it concluded its current term today. Our expert panel joins us to discuss. Allison Soman, Senior Legal Fellow at the Pacific Legal Foundation. Good to see you. And Jeremy Rosenthal, a trial attorney and the founding partner of Rosenthal, Calabas and Therian. Good to see you both. Allison, Jeremy, let's begin. The justices ruled to sharply curtail the power of individual district judges to block federal government policies nationwide. But there is some nuance to this ruling, of course. I'll start with you, Allison. How do you see the impact of this particular ruling on U.S. law, policy, and public life?
So I think it will make it harder for plaintiffs who are challenging government action to get an injunction. Although if they bring their suit in the alternative as a class action, they may have some alternative avenue for gaining relief.
Turning to you, Jeremy, your take on this?
That's correct. Functionally, what the ruling means today is that when if there's an executive order that might not be constitutional, it can still affect people and citizens if they have not directly themselves sued. And so it makes it much more difficult. Think about it like this. When the executive branch makes the order that they, in this instance, against birthright citizenship, which the dissent very clearly and very forcefully said violated the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. If the executive branch does that, they can still violate rights, even though it's clearly unconstitutional, and federal courts have called it unconstitutional. What they're saying is that functionally you individually have to sue for your rights, or you have to be within a group that has done this. If we make an analogy here, I think an appropriate one would be if the executive outlawed firearms for a certain sect of people and said, we're going to come and take away your weapons. Well, maybe you have the NRA that comes and sues and enjoins it. And if you're not a member of the NRA, well, the government can come and take your weapon and violate the Constitution. So it makes it much more difficult for individuals to do this, to enforce their constitutional rights. That said, I think the Supreme Court also gave a roadmap for how you fix that, which is going to be through legislative action.
Right, and Trump just now, we heard him calling it a big victory and an important day for his administration. Allison, how do you see this particular ruling influencing the Trump administration's agenda?
So, as was alluded to earlier from our other panelists, it will make it more difficult for some individual plaintiffs to get immediate relief in these cases. I want to emphasize, though, that this ruling is just about this procedural device. What the actual fate of the birthright citizenship order was not on the table, although some of the justices allude to it in their opinions. And so whether it is constitutional is something that will still remains to be decided by the courts.
And it looks likely that the Supreme Court will be deciding on that in October, as we just heard Pam Bondi saying. Jeremy, looking at what we've seen so far with the Supreme Court, how do you expect that decision on birthright citizenship to play out?
We'll see what happens. They've sent it back to the lower courts. It could rebound back up to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think one of the dissenters, I think it might have been, it's still a very new opinion and we're all still kind of cutting it apart. But I believe it was Justice Sotomayor who said that it would be back up to the Department of Justice to appeal it back up, and that they don't really have incentive necessarily to do that. And for that reason, we may not see it rebound. And to the broader question, what it functionally does, again, is it allows legislation, or it allows governance by executive order. Which is, I don't know that the framers intended to have the executive issue a lot of executive orders and essentially have that be the law of the land. But that's essentially what is happening. There has been a very sharp uptick in these types of rulings for the reason that there's been a lot more executive orders. And you can really point to the last 15 or 20 years, not just during this recent Trump administration. So it is, for the second year in a row, this time of the year, we've seen Supreme Court opinions that really fundamentally reshape the executive branch as it relates to the remainder of the government.
And Alison, I'd love to hear your thoughts in response to that, and also looking at the other decision today that parents with religious objections can opt their children out of public school lessons featuring LGBTQ plus themed books. And whether you think there's a shift in the Supreme Court that's indicated here, and what kind of precedent this might set.
Sure. So to the other panelists' remarks, I think that there is a role for executive orders that the president uses to manage the executive branch, such as how the president will manage his or her own employees, how grants and contracts will be doled out, and so on. The problem is that executive orders really shouldn't be used to displace the lawmaking function of Congress. It's Congress's job to make laws that affect the rights of private parties, individuals and businesses outside the government, and executive orders that substantially change the relationship of those individuals to the government that create new causes of action. That's concerning, and that's very likely an area in which administration is overreaching. On the religious free exercise case, I think I agree with your summary. This is an important case that allowed parents in Montgomery County to opt their children out of certain kinds of instruction concerning LGBTQ persons. I think that this is actually pretty consistent with the court's earlier decisions safeguarding the First Amendment right to free exercise. So I don't think it's a big leap jurisprudentially. I think it's an important win for those parents and for those who care about safeguarding religious freedom under the Constitution.
And Jeremy, what other Supreme Court decisions rank high in significance this week, would you say, and why?
Well, they're finishing off their docket, and they're sort of laying out their last sort of parting shots, if you were. I think that we saw several weeks ago a lot of the more 9-0 opinions come out. Those are the things that we know that they can sort of agree on. They did have they issued an opinion on the First Step Sentencing Act, which is a criminal justice one. Not a lot of things that we're going to read about here. Texas had an age verification requirement for pornographic websites, which they upheld. I don't think there's any shocks there. And with the Montgomery County case and the LGBTQ material, I don't know that anybody's really surprised that this court did that. Now, I believe I think the vote was 6-3 on all of these cases that were sort of down the party lines. But that's what you would expect. What they do is they bounce these opinions back and forth, and they respond to each other sort of almost in real time. And it's not a surprise that the more controversial ones are the ones that are sort of the ones that come down at the very end.
Alison, your take on the top most impactful decisions this week?
So one that hasn't got a lot of attention that I think is very important is FCC versus Consumer Research. This is a case about whether the executive branch can delegate authority to set rates for telephone service payments to a private administrator outside the government. This might sound technical, and the facts of the case kind of are, but the fundamental question here is, are laws made by Congress, or can Congress delegate that power to a private company outside of government? And if Congress can in fact do that, that substantially shifts lawmaking away from the branch of government in which the Constitution vests it to these outside entities, or in some cases the executive branch. It expands government power in ways that touches the lives of us all. And so unfortunately, the court voted to uphold government power, to uphold this delegation to this private firm. And I think that that's an unfortunate loss for the cause of individual liberty and safeguarding the separation of powers to protect individual liberty.
Jeremy, your response?
No, I think she's correct in that assessment. And if you want to take a look at this particular Supreme Court and in this term and the immediate terms prior to it, I think that's sort of a lot of what we're seeing here is the reshaping of the government, of the boundaries of the branches. With regards to not only regulatory agencies, but private third parties and things like that. Again, a lot of religious freedom type cases that they've not shied away from those. They've not shied away from weapons cases. But fundamentally and primarily what we've seen this Supreme Court, and when we look at this era, in 30 or 40 or 50 years, I think what we're going to remember it for is the reshaping of the executive branch with regards to the remainder of the government.
So you've both kind of agreed that it seems to be, at least with that initial case that we're talking about, this kind of rule by executive order being condoned, and I believe that plays into what you've been speaking about, Jeremy. Allison, how do you envision this potential impact 40, 50 years down the line, as Jeremy has been speaking about?
So I agree that this court has been looking carefully at the precedents governing the administrative state. It hasn't been as consistent as I would have liked in upholding the rights of the individual against the administrative state or enforcing constraints on it. I think that the consumer research case that I mentioned is an example of that. At the same time, there have been important wins in previous terms, such as the Loper-Bright case overturning Chevron deference, taking the thumb off the scale in favor of government in certain cases involving the interpretation of rules under a statute. And so I hope that the court continues on the path that it laid forth in Loper-Bright.
And Jeremy, just as you said that many of the decisions in this week have been perhaps the most controversial or least easy to gain full consensus right up. In terms of the reasoning behind the decisions there in the cases this week, has there been anything that you've noticed that is novel reasoning or perhaps particularly controversial? And what do you think of the counter-arguments that have been coming out?
We live in a Twitter society or an X society, which means that we like our storylines in 140 characters or less. When you read into these opinions, these are all extremely in-depth, very technical. The justices they know what they're doing, and you might disagree with some of the results that this might yield. But I think when you go through academically, they're pretty consistent and they're pretty solid. I think what I'm looking for are a couple of things. What I look for is Congress going to step in at some point and try to reform the judiciary's ability to enjoin nationwide? Are we going to see Congress try to take that step? Clarence Thomas said even if that happens, he's not convinced that it's still constitutional. And what we like to do in this country is we think in a result-based way. If we love Donald Trump, then we tend to love this opinion. But we have to remember that in 5 years, you might not have Donald Trump. Had this been the rule a year ago, Joe Biden's debt forgiveness program would be the law of the land unless you lived in one of those states that sued to enjoin it. So it could be a victory today, but this may be something that certain people won't like in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. But what you've had between, and I think what you're going to have to do ultimately is you're really going to have to look at the Trump v. United States from last summer and this opinion. You're really going to have to, in many ways, sort of look at those things together to kind of talk about the true strength of the executive branch, because I don't know that we've seen it be nearly this strong in our lifetimes. Will that change when the administration changes in 4 years or in 8 years or in 12 years? What happens when we get an executive that we're not so in love with? That we'll see what that happens with the test of time. That's what I'm looking for.
All right. And Allison, finally, what will you be watching for, especially in the next Supreme Court term?
So I agree that it's important to think about the implications of cases, not just for this particular term and not just to focus on how they affect this particular administration, but what the lines of authority are and what they portend for the future. And that's something that I'll try to do in reading cases this term and also for the next term.
All right. Thank you so much for your time today. Allison Soman, Jeremy Rosenthal, good to speak with you both.
Thank you so much for having us.